And I remember looking up and down the patrol line and watching enemy mortars hit. In particular, the platoon commander and the RO standing in the open trying to get on the net, and a mortar landed next to them. And I remember the sinking feeling of, I just watched those guys get killed, and there goes our radio. It's a really lonely feeling at that point. What I learned that day was mortars hate soft dirt. They hate plowed fields. So these guys got up covered in mud and just walked away. July 2nd of 2009, I was with 1st Battalion, 5th Marines at the time. We had been tasked as part of the landing force to retake Helmand Province, a significant portion of it down along the Helmand River near Garmsjur, Treknala. When we landed that morning, it was 0 dark 30, landed in a field that had been flooded, so everyone got stuck up to their waist in mud. It was a great way to kind of foreshadow the rest of the next few days. The local contact we were supposed to meet with didn't arrive. Later, we had found out that he had actually been killed because he was discovered as a local, sympathizer or informant. When we landed and we got off the Chinooks, we started moving through the fields along the tree lines, and we were taking very sporadic fire. And we heard a lot more gunfire near us, and we could actually see people pacing us along, parallel tree lines. They were definitely signaling with gunfire more than they were trying to actually attack us, but it lulled us into, a false sense of, these guys don't really want to fight. 6 or 7 hours in, everyone's already hot, tired, and worn out, crossing an open field. And what sticks with me that I remember the most is walking through a flooded field to a tree line of insanely dense foliage in the green zone, and thinking this must have been what it was like for the guys in Vietnam crossing rice paddies. The muck, the bogged down, the absolute serenity of the surroundings, and knowing that it could at any time become insane, violent. And as I had that thought and looked down at my feet, I heard and felt the first PKM burst fired at me. It was part of a very complex ambush. The mortars, the GP grenade launchers on the AKs. So you do what you're taught. You go prone and you turn and you face the direction of fire. I was carrying about 600 rounds of M240 ammo, a small rocket, and 3 HEDP mortars, along with what we were expecting to live off of for about 30 days. So enough weight that other Marines had to stand me up once I got my pack straps on. You've never gone prone in the mud with nearly your own body weight on your back. You're not doing much fighting or maneuvering in that situation. So I had the M240 and I had my M4 strapped to my main pack because I didn't think I would need it. There was so much confusion because of the amount of fire, the directions of fire, some of them from places we had just walked through that we didn't, it almost seemed at first like we might be getting shot at by our own guys who don't know who's who. That wasn't the case, but because we had just walked through there, it was very confusing. And I remember looking up and down the patrol line, about a platoon-sized line at that time, and watching enemy mortars hit. In particular, the platoon commander and the RO standing in the open trying to get on the net, and a mortar landed next to them. And I remember the sinking feeling of, I just watched those guys get killed, and there goes our radio. It's a really lonely feeling at that point. What I learned that day was mortars hate soft dirt. They hate plowed fields. So these guys got up covered in mud and just walked away. As I was kind of waiting for someone to tell me what to do, which was a response I didn't ever think I would have, looking around to see how many of my buddies must have been killed by this overwhelming volume of fire, what just kept gnawing at me was this disconnect of, growing up in a environment where you're told you don't hurt people. If you don't hurt other people, they won't try to hurt you. If someone tries to hurt you, you can get help. And ultimately that most people are not trying to hurt each other. And yet I'm watching the dirt clods kick up on me from the accurate machine gun and rifle fire of people that very much want me dead. People I've never met, people who I have, a lot in common with, but we don't speak the same language. We're from worlds apart. And who, had I not been in that field at that moment, that day, we never would have interacted. And the only interaction we're going to have is they're trying to kill me. And coping with all of that, or processing that, while understanding that if I want to survive, I have to fight back. I have to kill them before they kill me. So my understanding of morals and values was shook by the initial ambush, and the proper response to it is contrary to, regardless of how many hundreds or thousands of hours you've put into training, when you see someone in your gun sights, it's a surreal feeling of, I know what I have to do, but what I have to do is wrong. But also, not doing it means I, or worse, my friends and teammates will be killed. There's a disconnect and a disassociation that happens if you're going to survive that, which is all the things I thought make you a good person, all the things I thought are universal truths about feelings towards each other, or kind of compassion. Maybe there was naivety baked into that, where most of the world that's not so foreign, but to me on that day, I had to separate myself from who I thought I was supposed to be and who I wanted to be, and become someone that was cold and mechanical and reactive. We did fight our way out of that ambush, and we, actually no one was even hurt, which was, no Americans were hurt anyway. We moved forward, and that kind of shifted the tide when the enemy started to see that even with their superior numbers, their, superior knowledge of the area, and their ability to, they had tunnels, canals, weapons caches. So their ability to maintain an advantage of deciding when and where we would fight wasn't going to be enough to beat us. It put them off their center of gravity. But that was really even prior deployments, having gunfire come towards my location, or being around violence, was never directed at me. It was directed at what I represented and maybe where I was at. But to know that I was viewing someone through my gun sights and they were viewing me through theirs, and they were as determined to kill me or more than I was to kill them. That was the nature of our reaction to human beings who probably had a lot in common. Kids at home, adult men trying to take care of their family. We were then and there, nothing else existed except our desire to kill each other and go home at the end of the day. That leads to years of deployments after that, more firefights that were one-sided or not. There was an instant ability to disconnect, to disassociate from that. And that was a learned response, that disassociation. What's not a learned response is how you associate again, how you undo that. It's what we see a lot of guys struggle with, is maintaining those morals and values, maintaining that idea of, this is the kind of person I want to be and life I want to lead, and not still being always aware that at the end of the day, you're one action away from becoming just like them in order to survive. So for me, that shaped a lot of, I guess, the beginning of things that took me years and that I still work on to try to, come to grips with. At first, there was just a level of like surreal terror. There was like, I can't stay here, but the only thing they haven't hit yet is me. So, moving means I'm going to move into the area that they are able to hit. But it's just a matter of time. The thickness and weight of that mud. I remember turning to my section leader at the time. He was on the ground with our 2 machine gun teams. Someone I still talk to, every day, someone I respect a lot today. And I remember looking over my shoulder and yelling, "What the fuck am I supposed to do?" And him saying, "Get out of the field." It seemed so simple, but it was such a ridiculous thing to tell me I needed to do, because obviously if that was an option, I would have been doing it. But it was also the kind of kick in the ass I needed. It said, like, yeah, you got to do something. He laid down some suppressive fire with a couple of our other machine gunners there, ammo men and such. I remember popping the straps on my ruck so that I could leave all the gear I needed out in the middle of the open. My 240 was on a sling around my neck. So as I stood up, it dragged the 240 back. And I remember turning to run and knowing I was gonna die. You almost resign yourself. Like, I will be shot in the back of the head. It's not an if, it's a when. But how close can I get to cover to get back to behind this berm with my guys? And just waiting for it to happen, knowing it was gonna happen, and then sliding into this kind of, hole in the ground with a little bit of a raised berm behind it, and thinking like, well, I'm dying for sure. I must be in shock. And it was, I ran under enough fire that was also his response. My section leader ripping my IFAK open and starting to pull my gear off to treat me for gunshot wounds because of the tracers and the amount of dirt kicked up. And me saying, I think I'm okay, and him saying, you're in shock. And I was like, okay, yeah, that's what I assumed, so that must be the case. And then us finding out that I was fine, physically fine. I was now in a bad situation where all the ammo I needed for my gun, besides a 50 round belt, was 30 feet away in the open, in the beaten zone of a machine gun. So that was its own situation. But once I got back to cover, once we all sort of had that initial, eternity or 30 seconds, either or, we kind of got through that moment, and everyone started realizing, like, this is the thing we've trained for, this is the thing we've practiced and rehearsed. We were fortunate to have a few guys with us that day that had fought in Phantom Fury, so they understood the need to really put out an overwhelming volume of fire, use that HE solution, and then regain the initiative. But I was sure I was going to die that day. It took me maybe another day to realize I'm actually not dead. Yeah. And then later we went and got my ruck, and there was not a single bullet hole in it. So again, don't know how they managed to miss everything. They couldn't have done that if they tried. So how that initial response, or lack of, on my end affected me, I was embarrassed. That I was embarrassed by how afraid I was, which is stupid. I was embarrassed that I knew what to do, but still looked for someone to tell me to do it. And I felt like I needed to prove myself again to my team, to earn their trust that I would throw down when a brawl came our way. For the rest of that day, I was not afraid to engage. I engaged. I did my job as a machine gunner, both on individual targets that were firing at us and suppressing area targets so that we could maneuver. And I have no regrets on how I performed that. But I think for that, especially for that deployment, I always had a lingering sense that I had to overcome that single incident. That maybe I was the only one who felt like a coward, or that I was the only one afraid to do what needed to be done. Almost 15 years later, I know that that's not the case. I know that that's essentially what everyone who was in their first real firefight that day was going through it on some level. But it stuck with me until the end of my very last combat deployment. It shaped this again, a detachment from self, where my only value to me was whether or not my teammates valued me and trusted me. And from that point on, my own safety, or the personal consequences or repercussions as far as how they affected me, were a lower priority than if I failed my team, or if I even, whether it was fairly earned or not, if my team even perceived me of being too afraid or too much of a coward to take out there. Later on, as an element leader, a team leader, as a detachment leader on the ground for contracting and soft, it was always my priority: prove myself to my team, prove that I'm willing to fight, that I will be the one that takes the most risk when there's risk to be taken, so that the last thing they can say about me is that this guy was scared shitless when we were in that fight. It's silly to look back at now. I always knew, in the objective sense, that it was an unrealistic thing to prioritize. But in that environment, in that world that exists only when guns are firing and bullets are flying, everything to me was prove to your guys that you can take care of them and earn your place among them. Later on, as I matured and grew and took on those leadership roles, I think that actually helped me, because it's one of the downfalls of leadership is to immediately fall back on, I'm owed preferential treatment, or I'm above this task. It did stick with me that I have to earn every bit of respect. I have to earn my place among guys who I looked up to, even if I was their leader on paper. I admired all of them, so I wanted to earn that to back towards me. And I think today it still sticks with me as far as how far I tend to prioritize other people's needs, or even perception of my capability, what value I add to them. That might be something I struggle with forever, because of how much of a organic and pure way that lesson was learned by me. It just takes root in you, and there's a good part of it that comes with humility and respect for other people and selflessness, but there's also a consequence to that, where I will give until there's nothing left, and then I have what else can I do for people at that point? Or I'll put myself in positions that end up having negative outcomes for me, because I was so worried about whether or not someone thought I could be depended on. So I'm working on that. Like most things from combat, I will work on those probably until I'm too old to remember some of these stories.